The Bronze Age, a time when the use of this new material sparks the beginning of an era. In northern and western Europe, it extends from around 2000 to 800 BC or BCE, and because of my bubbling interest in prehistoric textiles, which appeared this past year, and my subsequent dive into the Stone Age and reconstruction of Stone Age textiles, eventually I also felt drawn to exploring the later parts of prehistory, once metal begins to make its more widespread appearance. I figured if I already was going to be constructing Bronze Age clothing, I may as well also put together an entire look, and so the next episode in the Historical Makeover series was born. I tried my best to work with tools and materials that may have actually been available during the Bronze Age. This is a hand-woven nettle fabric, and to cut it into shape, I used a flint blade. Much of the time, people assumed that just because there was bronze, now suddenly everyone started using metal tools, but that isn't necessarily the case. Flint tools work well, extremely well, and it was still a readily available material. So why completely get rid of something that is still working? Wouldn't it be better to have options? I used hawthorn thorns with the branches still partially attached to act as the head of the pin, and these work so well for securing layers of fabric together. For the stitching, I used a waxed linen thread and made some back stitches, felling them later on to secure any raw edges. This fabric was woven on a fairly narrow loom, the pattern of which comes from a brilliant book called Bog Fashion, which you'll hear more about later on. It's an incredibly simple yet ingenious design. I essentially cut two pieces the same size after taking a few measurements, and I folded one in half lengthwise and the other in half widthwise. One piece I stitched up to create a back body seam, and then the other piece I attached to that one to create the arms and the top of the bodice. I hemmed the armholes so that they had a neat finish, and all I had left to do was make a neck hole, which I decided to try attempting with a flint blade, because cutting curves can be very tricky with this tool, and I wanted to see how feasible it would be if someone with not that much experience with flint blades, compared to someone that's been around them since as soon as they could hold a blade, just to see if it would actually be possible. As you can all see, I am nearly finished with the tunic, bodice, blouse, whatever you want to call it, and I'm really impressed by it. It's amazing how easily it comes together, especially with this very zero waste style design. Bronze Age people were so intelligent, and they came up with such clever ways to utilize every little bit of fabric that they could. The only thing I have left to do on this is to bind the neckline. As you can see, it's still the raw edges from where I cut it with the flint, so I need to take care of that to kind of neaten it up a little bit because, yeah, this is also a look, but I want it to be a little bit neater for my own final appearance. In addition to handicrafts, I really love learning languages, and I found as well, just like with handicrafts, the more of them that I learn, the easier the next one tends to be. I've been spending time on and off in Italy these past months, researching various topics and filming videos on a variety of subjects. You've perhaps seen my Hiking the Dolomites in Medieval Clothing video, and in Italy, knowing Italian is extremely useful because it is estimated that around 13% of Italians speak English. In order to get around and to be able to better connect with the locals, Italian is extremely useful. Not to mention that it's an absolutely beautiful language, so I'm definitely not complaining. One of the ways that I've been learning Italian and keeping up with my practice is thanks to the partner of this video, Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone is a language learning program that uses a dynamic immersion method, which mimics the way that we all learned languages as children. They help you to go from just learning the new language to actually thinking in the language. Everyone is different when it comes to learning new languages. For myself, I know that art is one of the best ways that I can learn them, other than, of course, being immersed in the language being spoken in everyday life. Thankfully, there is so much beautiful Italian art out there, but it isn't often at my present level of experience. That's why one of the features I love is Rosetta Stone's Stories feature, which has original tales written in your language of choice, and it follows along with the experience of the lessons that you're working on. Each immersive lesson can be as short as 5 minutes, meaning that their language learning options can fit into your life, even if you have a busy schedule. And you can follow Rosetta Stone's lessons on your desktop, but if you're on the go, they also have a simple to use mobile app. And their audio companion lets you stream downloadable audio tracks that are related to the unit that you're learning. I typically practice Italian first thing in the morning when my brain is fresh, or whilst I'm on public transport and have 10 to 15 minutes to spare. With the exclusive link in my bio or by scanning the QR code here on screen, you can access all 25 languages from Rosetta Stone for over 60% off an unlimited language lifetime subscription. One payment with lifetime access. Thanks so much to Rosetta Stone for partnering with me on this video. And now let's go and keep on making Bronze Age clothing and learn a little bit more about it in the process. So I've been working on a Bronze Age skirt, and I'm going to talk all about the process of that in a moment, but I actually got the opportunity over the summer, this last year when I started to plan this outfit, to talk to an expert on Bronze Age fashion, Nicole DeRushie, and she's the author of a book called Bog Fashion, which is this absolutely incredible book which I've been referencing to make these garments, and it is an incredible resource because it actually offers patterns for Bronze and Iron Age clothing. I've never actually seen a book like that before, and when I heard about it, I really wanted to interview her and be able to make this video and actually get to check out the book. She gives me some tips on how to also accessorize and style my outfit for the other sections, and she also talks about the significance of Bronze Age fashion, why we know what people were wearing, and just a lot of other really fascinating information in this interview. I hope you all enjoy it.
My name is Nicole DeRushie, and I am an author of a book that has come out called Bog Fashion, which is just here behind me. I'm a museum educator, I'm a writer, and I do some social media, and my whole thing is making really interesting material about Bronze and Iron Age fashion and textiles available to a wider public who might be interested in that sort of stuff. That's basically what I do.
When I started to learn about prehistoric textiles, I felt so lost and overwhelmed. And then I was so excited for your book to come out. And when it finally did, I was like, yes, this is exactly what we needed, because there's so much beautiful information in there about something that isn't really available to a lot of people.
That's it, exactly. I think to have access to this, quite often you need specialist access to university libraries, for example, things that have never been digitized even, and that can be quite challenging. And people who might be interested in that kind of material then, you know, are barred from access to it, and that's no good. I think everyone should have access to that really interesting material because I think, as the book explores, there's lots of ways in which it can be relevant to modern lives, and maybe we'll go into that today, maybe not. Buy the book and find out. But no, I think it's a really good thing to make things accessible for people at all levels of crafting. Because I know that there are going to be people coming to the book who have a wide range of crafting skills, a lot of historical crafting knowledge, who can layer in their own particular skills into the patterning that is presented in Bog Fashion. But equally, my hope is that the book was going to appeal to people who are maybe at the very beginning of their crafting journey. They would love to do more hand sewing, for example, but they're maybe intimidated by taking a great deal of time and effort to make a garment with their own two hands. So yeah, I'm hoping that loads of different kinds of people, different sorts of crafters can participate.
So I'm going to be giving myself a Bronze Age makeover.
Yay!
I was wondering if you could maybe talk about some of the things that I could maybe look towards for what I could wear.
I would love to help. So I think if you want to focus on the Northern or Western European Bronze Age, it's a really fascinating point in history to want to recreate. The quality of preservation for clothing and textiles and accessories as well, more widely across Europe, is actually quite poor, especially the further north and west you go. So we're left with not that much evidence that we can draw from directly in the recreations that we do. Let's turn to Denmark. Denmark is the country which has, for the longest amount of time in Europe, sought out archaeological discoveries of clothing, to study them, to preserve them, and to make them available to the public. So there are a number of quite famous Danish Bronze Age burials that we can look at specifically for female clothing, if we're going in that direction. And those burials paint a rather striking picture of the well-to-do Bronze Age woman. The burials that have the best preserved clothes, we think, are quite clearly status burials. because not everyone would have the amount of effort put into their funeral that these particular individuals would have. And I'm speaking here particularly of the oak coffin burials, the split oak coffin burials. We have a series of burials in the Jutland Peninsula, which date from around 1300 BCE into that century. And an oak coffin burial is quite a lot of work. You chop down a huge mature oak tree with a trunk maybe a meter wide, and you're doing that with tiny little bronze axes. Now that's a huge amount of work just to begin. Then you square it off, you split it in half, you empty out the inside of the tree to create a chamber that your loved one is put inside together with some burial goods. That tree is then reassembled, propped up on rocks, and then covered over with a mound of earth. What you've done there basically is create a perfect time capsule for particular kinds of clothes. Because it's inside that really robust log, it's not going to be chewed up by frost heave or plowing, those kinds of things that can endanger really delicate remains in the ground. But you've also created a really oxygen poor and acidic environment within that capsule as well. When groundwater and rainwater leach through that wood, by the time it gets to the inside, it's really tannic, so it's really acidic. And that kind of condition essentially pickles whatever's inside. And certain kinds of material just melts away. It doesn't like that kind of environment at all. So it doesn't like flesh and bone. Yeah, not so much a fan of that environment. Plant fiber, not a fan of that environment at all. But anything that's protein rich, keratin rich, things like wool, like hair, nail, horn, these things are preserved beautifully. And it gives us a very clear picture of what these women and the men as well who had oak coffin burials were wearing when they went into the ground, because the clothing is still there, even if the body itself has largely disappeared and melted away. Some of the more famous of these oak coffin burials are ones like the egg-fed girl, who was buried in 1370 BCE. And what she was wearing when she was found caused an absolute sensation. She was wearing a short sleeve crop top and a skirt made out of strings, which sort of didn't even meet her knee based on how tall we thought she actually was, at 5'3" tall. My goodness, this really caused, a lot of people to be taken aback, because burials from the period had been found previously, but what the individuals were wearing perhaps wasn't quite so risque. And so that really showed a much greater range of fashion possibility for the period than what had been found previously. More typically for the period, you are going to get, again, a fairly fitted, close-fitting wool top, usually with a short sleeve, and a very simple slit or oval neckline. Now that could be changed up in a variety of ways. You could shape it and add some embellishment using embroidery. We do have some beautiful examples that have embroidery on them. You could, maybe if the shirt was a little bit too brief for you, you could add a strip of fabric around the bottom edge as well, and that would just help extend it down a little bit. Maybe that's, if you were growing up and suddenly the shirt that you wore when you were 11 suddenly doesn't quite fit you when you're 15, for example, you might alter it that way. Just an idea. You would also wear a skirt. Now, both men and women were wearing wrap garments at this time. There were no trousers that we know of that have been found from this place in this period. So you are going to wrap a piece of fabric around your waist. It will be quite a substantial garment. That's going to be potentially a sign of your status in your community, that you're able to afford or barter for or have access to in some way large pieces of woven woolen garments. This seems to be the latest thing in the early Bronze Age in Denmark. Pleat it or gather it, and then have it sort of, folded under or over quite an elaborate belt. There are some really beautiful belts that have been found, and I've just got one example here, one of my own hand-spun, hand-woven belts. This is one that is riffing off of one that was found of the woman of Bormeshoy. which is one of these famous Danish Bronze Age bodies. And her belt was quite wide, and it had stripes in it of 2 different colored wools. So they were taking advantage of the fact that sheep come in different colors in order to add a little bit of patterning into that weave. Because one thing that we can say really quite characterizes clothing of this period is that it comes just in natural colors. For the moment, using the technologies available to people who do research on the remains that have been found, no piece of Danish cloth, and a little bit more widely across Northern and Western Europe, nobody has found cloth from the Bronze Age that has been artificially dyed in any way. So we're not looking at bright blues and reds and yellows and greens the way that we do expect to find in the Iron Age. People were using colorful cloth further south and further east. And that's a technology that first would have come up into Europe through trade, like as in traded goods of dyed cloth. And then eventually the technology and the knowledge and understanding to dye would have followed. The problem for us is that burial traditions changed towards the end of the Bronze Age. We actually have more evidence for clothing traditions in the early Bronze Age than we do for the Iron Age as a whole, and even into periods beyond that, because people went from burying bodies whole in the ground, what's called inhumation, and then changing over to cremation, the burning of a body. Now, there's a little bit of a chance of survival for clothing. If it just goes into the ground whole, there's almost no chance of survival for a body that is burned. So from the end of the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, there's actually very little that we have in the way of evidence for clothing traditions, and certainly not enough evidence to be able to track the emergence of dyed fabrics, for example, because there is just such a huge lacking of evidence for that entire period. There is no doubt that dyeing was coming in the Bronze Age, and by the time we start to see more examples in the Iron Age, and textual evidence as well, of course, from Roman travelers and writers, that had been a tradition at that point for a long time, but we don't have the evidence to trace its origin or its progression.
And were people using things like tannins or ochre to dye fabric as well? Is there any evidence of this?
That's a really, really good question. And the answer is maybe. The problem with tannin-based dyes or stains, things like alder cones, things like walnut bark, things like apple or other fruitwood barks and things like that, is that if you then soak it for 2,000 years in a really tannin-rich environment, you're going to destroy your ability to pick apart what was color on the cloth and what wasn't. In my own practice, because I like color, I'm not averse to color, and I also really enjoy sort of poking at the evidence a little bit. I do like to include tannin-based dyed elements to outfits, just to start playing with that idea that what was being done in the distant past isn't always what we're able to necessarily point a finger at with scientific certainty today. Certainly people were using color, were aware of color. We have amazing examples of colorful glass, for example, that was being traded from North Africa, from the Near East up into Europe at this time. So yeah, I think if people had the opportunity to put color into their lives, they would have. But what we can say with some certainty based on the archaeological evidence is that the range of colors people would be using, say if they were to paint a piece of fabric rather than dye it, for example, or any work that would be done on leather or their own skin, is that there's just a limitation to the range of colors available. It would be limited to the earth pigments that people had available, specifically ochres in red and yellow. Maybe you could combine them, create a bit of an orange, and then of course black and white from elements such as charcoal and chalk. So in a building context, and I have to shout out here to Caroline from Peria Gallico, who is the woman who knows all about color in prehistory. We don't really have evidence for other sorts of colors in that period. Maybe people were experimenting with things like berry juices and things like that for cosmetic purposes, but that's the kind of evidence that really doesn't survive for us to say with any certainty.
Talking with Nicole inspired me so much to get to researching what I would do with my own outfit. I even purchased the materials to make the garments months before I started making them. With my top already complete, I got to working on the wool skirt. This one is made from an undyed hand-woven wool, and much like the nettle fabric, I cut this one with a flint blade as well. I pinned the pieces together with more hawthorn thorns and stitched them with a waxed undyed wool yarn and a bone needle. Since the yarn is thicker, I just went with a simple running stitch and then flat felled the seams so that they'd be finished. For the hem, I actually used the selvage, so I didn't need to complete it, which saved me so many hours of sewing. At the top of the waist, I blanket stitched the entire length of the fabric, which ended up being about 3 meters, so it took quite a few hours to do so. I later ran a piece of yarn through the whole length to form a drawstring, and the skirt was done, and it was time for my accessories and final touches. What kind of cosmetic and hair practices are going on in the Bronze Age?
It's so hard to say. If you look at quite famous sites like Ur in the Near East, quite geographically quite far removed from the bit of the world that we're talking about. Certainly there's a very strong cosmetics tradition. Egypt would be another really good example of a place with a strong cosmetics tradition that we can trace, because we have evidence not just of their paint pots, but their application tools and mirrors and things like this. We don't have that evidence for the Southern Scandinavian Bronze Age, the British Bronze Age. And that's a real shame, because it seems like a whole aspect of the traditions of personal appearance that we just don't have access to. It would be safe to say, though, that people had, quite clearly from the evidence we do have, a strong interest in their own personal appearance. People put time and effort into it. They really cared about how they looked. And so it would make sense, if they had access to things like ochre, that kind of natural earth pigment could then be applied to perhaps a little bit on the cheeks, a little bit on the lips. People, have always wanted to look healthy and to have their features stand out. And that's the kind of thing that goes back very, very far. We know that people were using ochre potentially in a ceremonial context, way, way further back than the Bronze Age. So the application of ochre to the skin or to a body generally is well evidenced in history. So you might get yourself a little bit of a seashell full of paint, and we have these sorts of vessels precisely like this from North Africa and from the Near East. So that's not too far removed from archaeological reality. You might want to take that very fine powder and combine it with butter or another animal fat or something like that to create a paste that can then be applied to the skin. Though precisely what you do with it, now we're in the realm of conjecture at that point, and it's entirely up to you. Something subtle, though, I think was probably the way we want to go. As far as hair conditions or hair traditions are concerned, a wonderful bit of evidence that we have from the oak coffin burials and more widely afield is the presence of combs. This is a replica of a kind of horn hair comb, many examples of which have been found in the Southern Scandinavian Bronze Age. All of the famous oak coffin burials had one that looked almost identical to this. So there was clearly something culturally significant about this form of comb, or at least there was a tradition of making this kind of comb in that general region, and it was the must-have accessory. People would be buried with them. Skridstrup women had one attached to her belt, for example. So there's loads of these, and they're really beautiful. People kept care of their hair. Egtred Girl had shoulder-length, short hair that was very carefully kept. Her nails were beautifully manicured as well. So these little details, her fingernails were literally the only thing left of the rest of her body besides her scalp, which is kind of gruesome but interesting to us because it lets us get a sense of some of their sort of hygiene practices. There are also loads of finds of really beautiful and ornate razors in lots of different fun forms. So potentially hair removal was something that people were practicing as well at the time. Men could be clean shaven, for example, rather than some massive tangly beard that we might imagine someone from prehistory having. These were people who put a lot of effort into their physical appearance. You might also look to the Screedstrip woman who I've just mentioned for her really, really elaborate hairstyle. She had ashy blonde hair. This is a burial from about 1300 BCE in the Jutland Peninsula. She was a woman of status. She had hair about as long as mine, about 2 feet long, about 60 centimeters long. And when she was found, her hair had been arranged into a really elaborate sort of a coiffure. All of her hair was slicked back on her head. A hair sort of pad was placed atop her head to give some volume up top. All of that hair was then combed forward over the front of her head. That was tied into place using cords. Her hair was then covered with a very fine sprang horsehair hairnet, and then an elaborate plait was used across the front of her head, using that remaining hair that was sticking out the front, really to finish that whole look. She was also buried with a really beautiful woolen hairnet, and wool sprang hairnets seem to have been a fairly common thing for people, for women specifically, to wear. It would keep your hair not just neat, but it would keep you safe as well, because then you wouldn't have your hair dangling into what you were doing. Certainly if you were around an open fire, you'd want to keep your hair back and neatly away as well. So even though we don't have many burials that give us an insight into these traditions, the ones that we do here paint a pretty clear picture of people who were very conscious of their appearance. They put effort into their personal hygiene, the care of their hair. There's no reason to think that they didn't also use things to enhance their beauty as well. They certainly had a great love of jewelry, and that's really well evidenced in the archaeology as well.
And what sort of jewelry could I put on me?
You love a bit of bling, and so did they. So you're in good company in the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is really when people start to, well, work metal for the first time. And even though the earliest gold working was happening further east and much further back in history, by the early Bronze Age across Europe, gold was being worked in really gorgeous ways, as foil hair beads, for example, or beautiful plates and sun discs that could be sewn onto the clothing. Screedstrip woman did have some gold in her outfit. She had 2 hoops of gold. That was just very roughly coiled 24 karat gold wire, very fine wire. And this was found either side of her head. There wasn't enough to determine precisely how she was wearing those. It could be that those were worn as earrings and they were actually through her earlobes. But alternatively, it could have been that they were worked through the fringe of her hair or even into the edge of her hairnet to sit over her ear instead. We don't know. So those are some things to maybe play around with and see what you like. Gold has been found in Britain and Ireland, of course, as well. Some really beautiful gold ornaments. I'm wearing, these are not real gold, but they are representative of really beautiful sort of lunula, these little sort of gold earrings that were found in France. Gosh, there's so much. The White Horse Kist burial in Dartmoor had a female person buried in the sort of earlier Bronze Age. She had stretched earlobes, as the person would have had to in order to wear these as well. And she had beautifully lathe-turned wooden discs buried with her, 2 sets, one smaller and one larger. And anyone who's gone through the process of stretching their ears knows that you need to size up. So potentially we're seeing that same practice happening thousands of years ago, which is really, really cool. People would use things like horsehair to plait really beautiful armlets and things like that. So it wasn't all gold, like there was lots of else going on. But of course, it's called the Bronze Age for a reason. And what a lot of women and men would wear is really beautiful bronze ornaments. Here's a beautiful example of a belt plate. This is an example from It's not real. This is a reproduction of the one from the egg-fed girl's grave. And this was worn on a thin belt at her waist so that it would have sat just under her belly button and would have kept the front of her string skirt sort of in place. And this was not a unique find. Lots of these gold discs, some of them really very large, have been discovered from the southern Scandinavian Bronze Age. And we think it might have to do with a fairly pervasive sun cult that existed in the region at the time. Loads and loads of spirals and discs. And you have to imagine these kinds of materials by firelight and sunlight. They would have absolutely glowed and flashed and been very good for catching attention. Really popular for the southern Scandinavian Bronze Age is like a heavy collar-like necklace. Not quite a torque, worn the other way with beautiful finials like we associate strongly with the Iron Age, but rather something that would sit and with the opening at the back of the neck that would really just sit here in a really beautiful and striking way. I've got another example of sort of the way that spiral motifs are being worked into ornamentation. This is a rather lethal looking cloak or blanket pin, and it's taken me a little while to figure out how to wear this without either stabbing myself in the stomach or poking someone's eye out. It's a bit of a challenge. I think probably you're going to want to wear it sort of obliquely across your chest like this, and that would help as well not have this really heavy end sort of tip downwards and slip out of your blanket as well. That's a pretty spectacular piece, but lots of sort of bronze wire objects as well, spectacle brooches, for example, spirals worked into really simply sort of wire wrapped rings and armlets and all sorts of lovely things. By the end of the Bronze Age, there was so much bronze in the economy that one theory for why so much is deposited in bogs, potentially as offerings to gods or to spirits of place or things like that, is actually an economical choice to take bronze out of the economy because it was making everyone's bronze worth less. So that's an interesting idea. If you think about people sort of starting to drip with the stuff a little bit, we can get a sense that maybe they're taking it a little bit too far. But it's lovely to pair what comes down to actually quite simple clothing in terms of material and tailoring with accessories like bronze and gold objects that would have added a real level of richness and texture and style to those simple outfits.
Yeah, I can just imagine how beautiful it must have been with like the grays and browns and black shades from the sheep wool. Yes. And then with the juxtaposition of the bright bronzes and golds, it would just be absolutely amazing.
And definitely when you see reenactors approximating outfits like this at Bronze Age festivals and events, that is exactly the impression you get. If they walk out of a darkened longhouse into the evening sun, they just look spectacular. And I don't imagine us reacting differently to how the people alive back then would have. There would still have been that, oh, that's such a gorgeous look. That's so amazing. And yeah, I'd love to see you capture a little bit of that, I think, in your recreation.
Last year, during my deep dive into prehistoric textiles, I also started to dabble in spraying, first taking an online course, and later beginning to study with an amazing teacher in person. I'm going to keep this all a little vague and secretive for the moment because I have future plans on this topic where I'll go into greater depth, but I figured I'd put my spraying to the test. This was my first time properly working with wool in spraying, actually, as I normally work with cellulose fibers, so it handled a little differently than I'm used to, but it was a very nice learning experience. I decided to keep the pattern simple and stick to Z-twist interlinking, which is one of the most basic spraying techniques. My hands got pretty tired, as I would say spraying is especially demanding on your hands, so I stopped about halfway through and continued the next morning. The whole hairnet took me I think around 10 hours to finish. Once my net was finished, it was curling a lot because I likely set too many rows into the piece and so it was quite tight. And anyways, the edges on this technique have a tendency to curl by themselves, but it was nothing a little overnight blocking couldn't fix. I decided to forego any cosmetics for my final look, and truth be told, I didn't even wash my face before this, and instead I wanted the focus to be the sprang net and this gorgeous bronze necklace, which is a replica made from Altmark bronze. I also really wanted to get a sun disk belt, but it just wasn't in my budget for this video because artisan-made bronze jewelry has a very understandably high price. So I braided my hair and pulled the cord of the skirt, and I got ready to film the reveal. I think the final outfit turned out so beautifully, and you might not be able to tell, but it was -1 degree Celsius when Devon and I were filming this, so I was pretty cold, which is why in this last shot I'm wearing my wool stockings and medieval turn shoes because I just couldn't imagine going with bare legs right then. A huge thanks to Nicole DeRushie for sharing her wisdom with us all, and be sure to go and check out Bog Fashion. It is such an amazing book. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks for another video.